we're going to try to include all of you in this conversation. So please participate, ask questions, throw us some softballs and some fastballs, and we'll try to hit them. All right? So I think what would be good, instead of me introducing our guests, is have each guest introduce him or herself, saying where you're from and what it is that you do. Why is it that you're here to talk about Cuba?
Like that?
What the hell do you know about Cuba, right? So where are you from, and what is it that you do connected to Cuba? So Isabel, I'll give you the first floor, and just take, just a brief introduction of yourself, where you're from, and what it is that connects you to Cuba and your work.
Thank you, Ted. So I'm in the most dangerous position here because I'm the first one, always, I guess. I'm presented as a filmmaker and as an activist because I made a movie about Cuba, Rethinking Cuban Civil Society, more or less from the same time than Juan Sin Nada. 2015, it was released in 2019. And, but I'm also the founder of Cuban Americans for Engagement, an organization that advocates for the end of the embargo. But I'm also a professor of Spanish and Cuban literature at St. Joseph's College in New York.
All right, wonderful. When you're not talking, at the very bottom of the microphone, there's a little button. If you could just turn it off when you're not talking so that we don't have any feedback interference. Harold?
Hi everyone, my name is Harold Cárdenas. I used to be a philosophy professor in Cuba right before coming to the US. I founded a blog in 2010 called How in Cuba. Today is a magazine, it's a non-profit organization too. I came to the US 4 years ago to do a master's degree in international affairs at Tulane University here. So since then I've been working on political risk in the private sector, but on most of my spare time, I still manage How in Cuba. That's a project focused on Cuba. So I'm very glad to be here. We know each other from a very long time, both of us, so that's good.
Roberto?
Hi, my name is Roberto Monticello. My father was Italian and my mother was from Spain. And they met in Cuba, and 9 months and 5 hours later I was born. Then I grew up in Cuba. I mean, what you call grew up is I spent a lot of time in Cuba through the years because my mother and father were performers, and they were also going back and forth to Cuba, even during the what they call the tough years, which is the 70s and so on. I have been going back and forth to Cuba since the very beginning. As a matter of fact, the first time I went back was 1980, when nobody was going back. I am totally committed to ending the economic embargo of Cuba. The embargo of Cuba, to me, is the biggest evil that I can ever think of, and I'm gonna do everything in the rest of my life to stop the embargo.
Thank you, Roberto. And now Ricardo.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Ricardo Torres. I'm an economist. So Juan Triana, by the way, the professor that you saw in the documentary, he was a mentor of my diploma, master, and Ph.D. dissertation. So I know him very well. And so I've been working at the University of Havana as a professor since my graduation in 2004. So I'm now in the U.S. doing a fellowship at American University in D.C., Washington, D.C. So I think I'm here in my capacity as an economist, I guess.
Someone might say, well, why do we bring an economist to a film? Well, you saw the film. You know exactly why we need an economist to talk about, especially the second film, but both films. So what I'd like to do tonight in our conversation is split our analysis into two parts as we discuss the two films. The first thing I want to do, because both films, or all films, you have aesthetic choices, you have a structure, right? You have how the film looks, how it sounds, how it was put together. And then you have, of course, the content. And those two things are obviously related to one another, but I want to try to separate them so that we can kind of talk about them in those two different aspects. So I would like to start by asking different of our speakers to comment on the first aspect of the films, on the choices that the directors made, on the aesthetic value, on how the films looked and felt in terms of images, right? The choice of some of the symbols or characters in the films, right? Obviously, those are all connected to the content, the messages that the films are making. Jason said at the beginning, I think very accurately, that the films make very powerful points about economy, the Cuban economy, but they're making, in some ways, different points, so they're making a different emphasis, right? One is about the US embargo against Cuba, and the other, you might call it the self-embargo in terms of the Cuban system, the Cuban economic system, and how it challenges, how it is to live within that system on a daily basis for Cubans, right? So I'd also like then to begin this aesthetic structural analysis by asking Isabel to react to the two films, and I'd also like to ask her a pointed specific question about Juan and the title of the second film, because there's a history there that's fascinating and instructive that the film is speaking to, especially for Cubans, you know, who grew up over the last 50 or 60 years, this Juan sin nada, and the kind of inside joke. So, Isabel, why don't you begin by commenting whatever you would like about the aesthetic choices and also the title.
Thank you, Ted. Well, first of all, thank you for presenting the conversation by making reference to this polarization that we Cubans and those who study Cuba are sometimes trapped in, which is the fault is the embargo is the culprit of everything, or the Cuban government is the culprit of everything. So this is a conversation that we're having here, I think, to take those topics beyond that frame, and I appreciate that you are making reference to that. In terms of the aesthetic, I have to say that these two films are, I found them beautiful when I saw them the first time. I know Alex, the director of Esperanza versus the Embargo. She's the director of the America's Media Initiative. And to me, the biggest gain is that they're both talking about difficult topics, politics, embargo, the economy, but they are doing it in a beautiful way. The animation, because of my conversations with Alex and because I also gave her input for this short animation, I know that she was trying to find a way to get to the point because we're living in such a dire situation with Cuba with the economic measures that Trump has imposed. So she's trying to find the fastest and the most effective way to get the message out, and the animation, the short film, was a beautiful way to do it. I'm fascinated by a few ideas from the aesthetic point of view of this animation. One, that she chose an African American superhero as the main protagonist, and that speaks volumes about the need to renew the voices that are discussing Cuban topic. It's usually white men who have been, perpetuating this suffering. So the fact that there is a Cuban American young woman in that animation gives me a lot of hope. I think it was an aesthetic choice that it was very thoughtful, and there are many references in the animation to the struggles of the African American, then the symbolism that you mentioned, Ted, when we were discussing about the Is that the name of the Sankofa? In Cuba they say differently, but the Sankofa, which is this bird that appears many times sometimes in the animation, and which is from Ghana, and it means to look back, to retrieve something that is lost, and at the same time the feet are facing forward, so it's looking back, but to face forward. It gives me a lot of hope. In terms of Juan Sin Nada, I think it's a great movie. I mean, I wouldn't have thought of any other way of addressing such a difficult topic, which Ricardo and the rest of the experts are going to decodify for you because of the CUC, but that, by the way, is out of date because they don't have a double currency anymore. But the way that that Ricardo Figueroa, which, by the way, he's sending me a short message on Facebook to at the end, maybe we can listen to him. I said 1 minute only. And the choices that he made in terms of black and white, slow motion, fast motion, in terms of the scale, the close-ups, right? In which we have either the faces of the characters juxtaposed to a piece of chicken or pollo por pescado, or a piece of, anything, a vegetable. That kind of dehumanizes the characters, because that's what we are living, or they are living in Cuba. It's such a level of despair and suffering that, I think it's a really good choice, the way that he used the cinematographic elements, the scale, the close-ups, the black and white in those TVs that I was asking Ricardo, are they still using those black and white TVs in Cuba? And he said no. So he said that's an aesthetic choice that he's making by presenting all these old guys from the cadres from the Communist Party repeating the same things over and over again in black and white, because this is from the past and the young people need something different. We were discussing before, Ricardo and I, that there is here we have I think 3-4 different generations. I was born in 1972. Harold, probably you were. Well, anyway, we're from different generations. Let's not get into details. Con mucho cuidado. But the fact is that people that were born after my generation, like Ricardo, in the 80s, they didn't get to know the revolution. And they were sold that message, and they are repeating something, or they are being asking to repeat something in which they didn't have the opportunity, because the 80s where you could relatively live well in Cuba, not anymore after the 80s because of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So all these things are here in a way or another, and the chaotic use of the cinematographic elements, it conveys that sense of despair, that sense of anguish and need to renew the language. That's what really called my attention, the way that he uses those elements to talk about such a difficult topic, which is Cuban economy.
And Isabel, before I pass the questions on to some of our other invitees, speak specifically to Juan Sin Nada, the character, and where that's from, or what is that referencing for Cubans?
Right, so Juan Sin Nada is a reference from Nicolás Guillen's, who is Cuba's national poet. His poem is called Tengo, and it's from 1964. There are a few stanzas here that are really striking, because the poem is about a black person who, after the revolution, says, I finally have what I needed to have. Tengo lo que tenía que tener. I have education, I have free health care, I have the possibility of going to a hotel. And when you read the poem now, you realize that is not what current Juan, the Juan in the movie and the Juan in real life is the one from before the revolution, who didn't have all these things. So it called my attention one of how he uses his name, and one of the verses says, I have, let's see, that being black, I can be stopped by no one at the door of a dancing hall or bar, or even at the desk of a hotel, have someone yell at me that there is no rooms, A small room and not one that's immense, a tiny room where I might rest. And this is exactly what was happening for many years in Cuba. People were not allowed to go inside a hotel if you were not a tourist. And now they can, but they don't have the money. So the fact that the title, Juan Sin Nada, is because of the poem by Nicolás Guillén, and it's a big irony because here we are, 60 years after the revolution, and Cubans still don't have anything. Blame it on the embargo, blame it on the Cuban government, but the fact is that they don't have anything. So it's the best choice to name the movie The Unlucky Story of Juan Sin Nada.
For me, that was really powerful, especially at the end of the documentary. Two of the real-life persons that they had interviewed and who shared, their comments. One said he was saying how he's worked hard his whole life. He doesn't want to become a delinquent or a criminal, but what does he have to show for it? And then he says 3 times, "Hasta cuándo? Hasta cuándo? Hasta cuándo?" And for me, that is, and you have these characters that were created, right, in terms of the choices, these fictional characters, but then you have real people, and going back and forth between them, you have the different Juans, right? And at the beginning of the film, remember it says, "Oh, he's just a worker like any worker." And then it says, "Well, no, he's a worker in Cuba," right? And this is what the film is going to be about. And then there was the other man, also Afro-Cuban, and he said, about to cry, right? He said, "I don't really call my right to my daughter, but she calls me, and if it wasn't for her, I would have died of hunger," right? And he, they kind of cut it off because he was very emotional. So those, to me, really hit home, related to the theme and to the term Juan Sin Nada. Now what I'd like to do is shift over to the content. But first, anybody else would like to comment on some of the aesthetic choices, the filmmaker choices, especially since Roberto, you're a filmmaker. As a filmmaker, maybe you could just speak to some of the choices in either of the films or both of the films that were made and how and why they communicated different messages.
Well, obviously, these were very low-budget films. I see a lot of films that I like, some that I love, but I only respect films that have a point of view, that have something to say. And these ones have something to say. So I have a lot of respect for these films. I don't have to agree with a lot of the, what you might call, things that they say, but I respect them. So I think it was, both of them were good works of art, and it must be seen.
Thank you, Roberto. Harold, did you want to comment at all about the style, the aesthetics, the choices, the humor, any of that before we get into some of the content? We can move on. Okay. Well, then now I'm going to pass the microphone.
I think Isabel said most of everything that I was going to say.
Okay. Well, we'll let someone else go first next time.
It didn't leave me room for any.
That's what happens when they sit me in the first chair.
Okay.
So what I'd like to do now is give Ricardo an opportunity as an economist and as a mentee of Juan Triana, who was in the film and who was giving the kind of play-by-play explanations, to comment on the economic angle that the film Juan Sin Nada makes, the economic argument or point that it makes, but also I'd like you to kind of help us fill in the gap between when this film was made and what has changed for the better or for the worse in terms of reforms to the narration that is described, especially in terms of the dual currency, but also perhaps in terms of self-employment or small and medium-sized enterprise, so any of those things. Here, I'll give you this.
Well, Yeah, it's okay. So today we well in Cuba. So the economy doesn't, have two currencies or two national currencies because both. Remember that both CUP and CUC were Cuban currencies, both of them. Even though Cubans call the CUP moneda nacional or national currency, but both were Cuban. But that's no longer the case. In January 1st, 2021, that changed. So the government unified the two currencies and the exchange rates as well. Now, we do have two currencies because now there is a significant segment of retail trade where you have to use the US dollar or the equivalent to US dollars because you can deposit in a card that is managed by the Cuban banks. Any of the 12 international currencies that are traded and recognized by the Cuban Central Bank, and they would deposit that and make accredited an amount that is equivalent to US dollars according to the amount that you deposit, or you can transfer. People can transfer money from other countries to those accounts. Again, so the CUC is no longer a currency in Cuba. Most prices will be in Cuban pesos, and then you have a segment of stores that sell goods, and there are now even some services that are sold in US dollars, essentially. So we eliminated one national currency, but we ended up having still two currencies, one that is Cuban and one that is, the US dollar. And so most Cuban economists agree that we needed to change the dual currency system that we had before. It's just our opinion that, one, the way it was done could have been different to achieve the goals that the government talked about. And second, the timing was not good. Because remember, January 1st, 2021, the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Cuban economy was hit hard because of its over dependence on international tourism. Tourism came essentially to zero. And a scenario that no one anticipated at any point before. And also, in part due to Trump's measures, remittances have dropped as well. Remittances are a key source of income for Cuba. So, again, it was the perfect storm, essentially, for the Cuban economy. And in the midst of that situation, the government decided to unify the currencies. In a way, it's tragic because, we've been advocating for the unification for a long time. And the government decided to do it specifically at the worst possible scenario. For those who are Cubans here, we would know that that's something that's been part of our history for a long time. Our timing is never good. For whatever reason, we should aim at changing that, frankly speaking, but truth is that the timing was not good. And now what we have in Cuba is, again, a growing number of goods and services being sold in US dollars, and also a big spike in inflation. Because, there are not enough goods and services available to sell. So, and then, for those who are just a little bit familiar with how a market economy works, or even how economics work, supply and demand, that interplay. So now demand is very high, but supply is very low. So prices go up, inevitably. So that's what's happening. So all of the prices that you saw in the film, that's no longer true. That's maybe now 5 times, or even in some cases 10 times the prices that you saw there. And there is another big problem, which is the exchange rate. It is the same. So the dollar and the Cuban peso, the exchange rate is 25 Cuban peso for $1. But it shows that in practice it only works when you sell dollars to the government. they will buy those dollars at 25 pesos. But if you want to buy dollars and you go to a Cuban bank or to an exchange house, you will not be able to buy dollars at 25. So actually the black market exchange rate for the US dollar right now, it's like 70 pesos for $1 US and rising. Of course, that's just the other side of the coin when you have inflation. You know, the national currency will lose value vis-a-vis the foreign currency. So it's not only that it's very difficult for people to make a living out of the wages they get in the public sector. I mean, even in the private sector. It's also the situation right now. It's a lot more unstable compared to the situation that the film was describing. So that's more or less the situation right now. It's quite challenging, I have to say, for people's daily lives. So they have to queue for essential goods, long queues, I have to say, and prices change essentially on a daily basis. It's a challenging situation.
Harold,
So one more thing about the embargo. You know, we've always had this kind of a conflicting views on the embargo. So during my academic life, I've always been thinking, what is the right approach to this? You know, I want to be fair, but I want to be objective as well. And watching the films, something came to my mind, which is, of course, the embargo is part of the explanation for Cuba's economic problems. But the issue is, if in Cuba, but there are other factors at play, of course. Many of them have to do directly with Cuba's economic system. Central planning didn't work anywhere. And that's a fact. That's not subject to interpretation. That's a fact. It was tried in very rich countries like the Soviet Union. It was tried in industrialized countries like Czechoslovakia before the Second World War. It didn't work. It didn't work anywhere. The Chinese and the Vietnamese both decided to experiment with something else. So, but the issue is that if we in Cuba if we gave all the factors the same weight that we currently give to the embargo, we wouldn't be speaking about the embargo on a daily basis. So there will be one day for the embargo, but maybe the next day we will be talking about state-owned companies. Then the next day probably will be about talking about why don't we expand further the private sector. Then, but truth is that in Cuba, at least, the government and official media, they don't give the right weight to each of the factors behind Cuba's economic problems, and that's a big issue.
So what you're saying is that we wouldn't see Juan Senada on Cuban television?
No, and again,
the message of that film is a protest in some ways, as I say at the end, against the almost exclusive focus and blaming exclusively the embargo.
Exactly.
Right?
So the thing.
Whereas the other film is also protesting, right, the embargo, right?
Right. So the message will be, and this is the way I see it, is not the embargo or the other things. Is let's talk about everything. If we want to have a serious and deep, profound discussion about the problems that the country faces, which are enormous currently, it should not be only the embargo. So we have to be fair. So I don't know, maybe 20% is 25% is the embargo, but what about the 75%? The other 75%. So that's the message, in my opinion.
What I'd like to do now is give Roberto and Harold time to comment, and then we're going to hopefully hear from you guys some questions that maybe occurred to you or in response to some of the commentary. So, Roberto.
Okay. There are many realities to Cuba, many realities. And there are many solutions and there are many problems. But step number one to get Cuba back in some kind of economic situation that would be helpful has to be the end of the embargo. The end of the embargo will open the possibilities that we don't have right now. And without the embargo, with the embargo, there's no chance. There's no chance. And the Cuban government is not going to change. I travel all over Cuba, up and down, all around, and I can tell you for a fact that there's a lot of people that say, okay, we are suffering, but we are going to stay the way we are. The embargo is the one thing that has to go first. I'm going to make it short, because he has to speak too.
Thank you, Roberto. Harold.
Thanks, Ted. The national hero of Cuba is Jose Marti. When you read his works, you can pretty much summarize his works in the prioritization of independent freedoms, like individual freedoms for the Cubans, and the defense of national sovereignty. That's pretty much Jose Marti. He was very focused on Cubans being free in Cuba, and at the same time that Cuba was a free nation. Historically, we've had very hard time combining both things at the same time. Cubans love to cherry pick this. We love to choose and say, okay, national sovereignty is the thing that is most important for me, so I'm not really going to care about political freedoms or economic freedoms. Another kind of Cubans do the opposite. They love political freedoms and they love that kind of thing, but they are not really interested in how Cuba is going to have a relation with the U.S. in an obviously asymmetric relation with a big power as the U.S. as its neighbor. Like how are we going to maintain sovereignty next to the U.S., which is a very hard thing for any country. So Cubans, our lack of nuance, I think, is a national trait that we have never really discussed deeply. Another thing is, like, we also have a historic trouble with democracy that we don't want to address. Like, we like to focus on the revolution and we like to, to choose sides, but we don't want to address that we fall very easily into populism. We fall very easily into authoritarian behavior. Like, there is a reason why Cubans generally are far left or far right. Like, it's very common to find Cubans choosing a very extreme side and having a general lack of nuance because there is no conversation about it. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to discuss that we have these issues that are a national problem, and they will persist. So our history pretty much has been one group taking the other guys from power and stripping away their political rights, and then the other guys do the same to those, and you cannot advance a country like that.
And be very careful if you try to be somewhere in the middle.
Yes, it's really hard.
Centrismo, right?
I'm gonna land in the documentary. I'm gonna focus on the documentary now. It's very, very hard to do a piece of film on the embargo. Why? Because you can see, it's easier to shoot. Well, not easier, but it's more visible. The effect of government mismanagement, for example. Like, you can show how the government has mismanaged things. You have examples. You have people that want to be witnesses of that. There is a thirst for that, and there is a very visible way to show it. But how do you show the effect of U.S. policy on Cuba? It's super hard to do it. It's super hard. That's why many people don't really do it. But the effect, like, it is dramatic, the effect on U.S. policy on Cuba. Like, the embargo is not addressed as it should be to the government officials of the Communist Party. It's not addressed, it's not really targeted. The embargo is an embargo on every single Cuban. I'm not able to send remittances to my family, not even when they're in a hospital with COVID in Havana. So there is no moral or political explanation that you can actually sustain for that policy. But it is what it is, and nobody's really paying attention, and people are dying in Cuba. There is a general lack of empathy. Cuba right now is in a spiral of radicalization and in a spiral of polarization. After the protests of July 11th, you will see many Cubans, and every person that dies in Cuba today reinforces your idea that either the US government is criminal and it wants to kill us, or the U.S. government or the Cuban government is criminal, you know, because it's killing its own people. So it reinforces every single thing that happens, reinforces your preconceived idea about what is going on. And it's because people don't really have the nuance to consider that, okay, there is government mismanagement, there is a legacy of authoritarian behavior in Cuba that we have to address. There is all these things together, and you can naturally pick which of those you want to solve. You have to take the whole pack with you. And that's where we are with the documentary. I am fascinated with the second documentary because I know half the people in the documentary there. So it's fascinating to see them here in New York.
Yeah, yes, here you go.
I wanted to say something. In that case, we are very similar to the United States today. Okay? I mean, we are very similar to the United States today. I consider myself the one that he said doesn't exist, or doesn't exist. Many are not, which is in the middle of the road. In Cuba, I'm a dissident, and I'm considered a dissident and treated like a dissident. In the United States, I'm a communist. So, there you go.
Okay. Isabel, why don't you make a comment and then we'll have some questions, but try to make it brief.
Yeah, just want to add to that. I agree with that, and I just want to give a quick example. Also for Cuba, I have been advocating for the end of the embargo as you, Roberto, and one day they decided to put a picture of me in the national newspaper in Cuba saying that we were from the CIA, just because we participated at a panel funded by Soros, Open Societies. And we have received death threats here in the US because we are advocating for the end of the embargo. So this is a crazy reality. Nuance, yes, I think we lack nuance, but at the same time, I want to say that we're sophisticated people too. We're well educated. It may be that we're trapped in a historical dilemma that we don't know how to solve, but we also have the education, the sophistication, and I have hope that we can move forward. I want to have hope.
Until your name or photo is not in grandma, you have not accomplished anything. So consider yourself successful. All right. Yeah, raise your hand and stand up and maybe shout out your question. I think we can probably hear each other. Yes, sir.
I'm curious what each of you think, not what you as individuals think, but what you think the people are saying who participated in the July protests and what was going on in Cuba. What are they just angry? Are they making a particular point? Do they have different points? What are they trying to express?
Okay, in this I will be a participant and a moderator. So I'm going to speak first here. I'll speak briefly. First thing I'll say is that there is a lot of diversity of opinion and takes, and there's no pueblo cubano with one voice. The Cuban people have a lot of different opinions and complaints, and they're focused, and they can be complaining about 2 or 3 different culprits at the same time. However, in my analysis and following it very closely, although not in Cuba, I would say that the fundamental focus of the protests was triggered by lack of access to medicine, lack of access to food, the scarcities, which probably have the 70-25% responsibility of the embargo, but the culprit who's most close and who was being blamed is the Cuban government, right, for the economic scarcity and lack of access to medicines during the crisis and the spike in cases. But also remember that people in the streets were shouting freedom. They were shouting down with the system. They were shouting, the president is a fucker, right? Singao, right? And they were saying, we are not afraid. And I think that, again, you cannot generalize, but to me that was the main focus. And then the crackdown was both physically violent against the protesters, who were largely nonviolent, and the internet was shut off for 3 days and then only gradually restored. So the government cracked down both in the street and online to try to control that virus of dissent from spreading. So that's my take.
Can I say something to that? I have family in Cuba. Some of them are in one side and some of them are in the other. Two of my cousins, one and second cousin, they participated in the protest. They were part of the protest. One of them got arrested. But at the same time, they do not want radical change in Cuba. They want better system, better run, and the possibility of going to normal. But they do not want to be capitalist. They do not want to support Trump or whatever. So I see the two sides of it. And I can say it breaks my heart, you know. Look, you know, I mean, I carry Cuba in my heart like an open wound. You know what I mean? And anything I can do for Cuba, I will do it. And I know that the only way that I see for the future of Cuba is democratic socialism. That's the only way. It cannot be capitalism, it cannot be communism. In my opinion, neither one works. Both of them bring with themselves a lot of injustice, a lot of pain. Before the revolution in Cuba, there were 6 million people. Of those 6 million people, less than 1 million owned everything. Everything. And they were the whitest ones. Okay? That's the way I feel about it. I'm sorry, I don't want to get too intense here because I can go on forever.
Thank you, Roberto, for that candid recount, and I agree with you, and I have to say, I mean, I cannot say Cuba will be this or the other, but I agree ideologically with you. The fact is, how do we know what Cubans want? There's a variety of people, and I support what you say. Many of them don't want radical change, and many of them, they grew up in Cuba, and they learn to know that health is a human right, education is a human right, and they don't want to trade that. It is in crisis, no doubt about it. But there is a gain, there is a collective consciousness about those things that are positive for them. You don't have the problem that we have here explaining someone that healthcare is a human right. They know. So that, and to support what you said, there are groups in Cuba. For example, there was a guy that was put in jail because he went to the streets, not July 11th, but a few months before, I think, with a sign that, and he's a friend of friends. The sign said, "Socialismo sí, represión no." Yes to socialism, no to repression. So that tells you the idea about these sophisticated people that we have, besides the lack of nuance, that they want to explore something different. In terms of the protests, I would say the interesting question here is not what they were demanding. Well, they were demanding freedom, medicine, changes, but why were they doing it? Well, because there has been a change in Cuba after 2018. You are the expert here with the use of the 3G technology in the phones, so everybody has access to fast internet. So they're using social media, WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook to call for protests. What happened on November 27th was the result of that too, was a WhatsApp call for a protest. So these things have been there for a long time because changes in Cuba are long overdue, right? But the fact that they became possible now is because of the use of the internet. And yes, there is censorship in Cuba, but hey, people are using WhatsApp and Telegram and Facebook, and so far, I don't know how they haven't blocked, the government hasn't blocked it, but that's why it was possible at this point.
The person that you just mentioned that was arrested, Leonardo Negrin, I think he's 19 years old. He's a young socialist in Cuba. He was arrested in the protest. So this speaks to what Ted just said, that the protest was very diverse. People motivated with their very different goals. So putting a tag to it it would be serious to say that. That said, if we want to point fingers on the protests, I think we have to talk about shared responsibilities here. We have to talk about a Cuban government that hasn't fulfilled the people's hope of comprehensive reform to the economic and political system, because this is not only an economic problem, there are also many political problems in Cuba. So that government has a responsibility. The US government also has responsibility because the embargo makes life miserable in Cuba to most Cubans. So, for example, the Biden administration's reaction to the protests was to capitalize politically what was happening, but not to recognize any responsibility, not to acknowledge any responsibility on it, which is also not really responsible politically speaking. So this lack of actually, like being honest about it and acknowledging that this is a complicated issue. There are many responsible parties. You were just speaking about the future of Cuba and that kind of thing. I want to point a light into. I think that maybe the greatest document in the history of Cuba is the Constitution of 1940. The Constitution of 1940 was considered the best constitution in Latin America at that point. There is a reason why the Constitution was so good, and people still talk about it. The Constitution was written by every single movement in the island. Every single political party participated in that. You had the liberals, you had the conservatives, you had the communists, you had all of them sitting in the same place writing a constitution that is considered the best in the history of Cuba. And that was a landmark in the region. So there is a way to do things, but people don't want to do it. People don't want to sit with the other guy. And that is the main problem. Many of the solutions that we're listening right now to the political crisis in Cuba is not that. It's pretty much taking the communists from power and putting other people in power and stripping away the political rights of the communists. So that's not democracy either. That is regime change, but it's not democracy. So we have to learn what is democracy. That is doing things together like we did before.
Ricardo?
Well, sorry.
Yeah.
In the meantime. I think all interesting things have been already said and discussed. But I want to highlight first, I was in Cuba, so that maybe gives me a little bit of more of a legitimacy here. Although I didn't participate directly in the protests, but I was there. I talked to people that was participating, and then I talked to people in the aftermath of the protests. So first, there were all kinds of people participating in the demonstrations. That's very important. Well, all kinds of demands put forward. Essentially moving to in the whole political spectrum. There were economic demands. There were very simple daily life demands, and they were all more political. Even talking about democracy, freedom, and many other things. So there were all kinds of people. So it would not be serious to say, the word protests, because it seems to me, this is important because no one has been able to claim that, this group or the other organized the protest. This is very important. Protests started as a very spontaneous act, localized in a very specific town in Cuba, and then through social media spread out to the essentially.
And also from Miami, there was a little bit of.
Of course, every political group. So, now that you say that, one of the saddest things, in my opinion, was that every political actor inside and outside Cuba, in the aftermath, they tried to take advantage of the protests. Using the protests for their own political benefit. All of them, the Cuban government, organized groups in Cuba, and organized and even disorganized groups outside Cuba. So everyone positioned itself, and then let me try to take advantage of this because this is a major thing. No doubt, the most significant demonstrations against the Cuban government in 60 years. That is something. So, and the other thing that I didn't like about the what was said about the protest is, one, there were some labels attached to the participants of in the protests. I don't think everyone was a criminal or paid for someone in the United States or even so-called confused people. I think that's really, I mean, in many ways, it's very disrespectful to those who participated there. Because, you know, people have opinions and it doesn't mean that they're confused or are ignorant about that. So I think that was a very big mistake. And then trying to put everyone that was on the street that day in one single basket, my opinion, has been the biggest mistake by all of the parties that tried to take advantage of the protests in Cuba. Now, I believe as well that there are all kinds of reasons for people to demonstrate against the government, because there are all kinds of arguments, and it's fine. I mean, people are not happy with their lives, they should let the government know. And if the formal system doesn't allow you to do that, well, you take the streets and make your argument about your, insatisfaction with the current state of affairs. My personal take is that all that has happened after the protests is just making things worse in Cuba. There is a big drive now in the country towards polarization and radicalization. And I don't think that's a way for Cuba to solve its problems, unfortunately. But that's the situation that I'm seeing unfolding in the country in the aftermath of the demonstrations.
Can I add something? Really quick. And the other saddest part about that is the reaction of the Cuban government to the protests. Let's just not only tell you that you're a criminal, but let's pit Cubans against each other. Let's take the streets, because the street is for the revolutionary, la calle es para los revolucionarios. So you're gonna get what you deserve if you're protesting against the government. That was the reaction of the president, and that's wrong. Even if some of that protest, which I don't think it was the majority, but even if there was some element instigated from Miami with the SOS Cuba, whatever hashtag, those are Cubans too, and they are claiming for something. They are part of your nation. They are the diaspora, but they're part of us. So not paying attention to that is a big mistake, and unfortunately, that's, as you say, things are getting worse.
I'm going to follow up on what Isabel just said. For a long time, the Cuban government has disrespected the diaspora of Cubans. And the relationship has been intentionally bad, to call it, to be gentle. It is problematic. But at the same time, it is problematic that most of the Cuban diaspora is focused in Florida and even in Madrid in Spain. You know, like when you look at the numbers of where Cubans migrate, they migrate to the hotspots of radical right-wing ideas. So it is problematic that many Cubans in the island right now, the ideas that they have about democracy is Florida-style democracy, which is not good. So it is a conversation that also people are not having. So should we take tips from Florida about what democracy is, about Ron DeSantis, style of democracy? Because many of those Cubans are Republican Trumpists, and they have. So you have to put in a balance the right of participation that they have as Cubans, with at the same time that these are also radicalized right-wing Cubans. And there is a machine of radicalization in Florida that the Biden administration is not breaking at all. They want to play with the radicalization machine. They don't want to break it. And there is a machine that you arrive to this country and you become a fervent Trump supporter a month later. So that is not being addressed. We have to be very careful also of where do we get the tips of what democracy is, because why should I change an authoritarian left-wing government for an authoritarian right-wing government? Why my options are Stalinism in the Caribbean or Bolsonarism in the Caribbean? So I think that's an issue we have.
Harold, I'm a refugee from Florida, so I appreciate what you said. Okay, but I'm from Pensacola, which is even more red than South Florida. So So I get it. I would like to give the audience another opportunity. Yes, ma'am?
Yeah, I've been holding my breath. I have like many different things going through my head at the same time, so you have to bear with me.
So do we.
One thing is that I've always believed this, that Cuba really stepped up to the plate when it came to helping other countries in medical emergencies and things like that. So, I mean, I can't point out all the individual things, but I know they existed because I read about them. And before the pandemic, you know, that she went and she helped and sent people and educated people and has brought people to Cuba to educate those who can't even get it in their own country. There have been Americans who go down there. So, you know, there's definitely a kind of an imbalance going on here. Honestly, I'm ashamed of my country, the United States, where I'm born and probably will die. And the bottom line is, we're a big country, you're a little country. What the hell do I have to prove to you? Why does this have to go on forever? It's no different than going to Vietnam and saying, I'm bigger than you, and I'm gonna bomb the hell out of you. It just goes on and on. I just saw the other day, the United States has 800 military outposts around the world. 800. So that's bigger than England ever was. You know, there's so many things that you said that are, what's the right word? That is similar to what's going on in this country, but on a different scale. You know, I mean, unfortunately in the United States, the majority of people don't care about politics. They don't give a damn. They don't even know what an embargo is. They don't have a clue, and they don't care. So, you know, it's one thing, I'm here for my own personal reasons, namely that I'm going to say what it is. When I was young, like 6, 7, 8 years old, standing at the kitchen table in Queens, and my mother packing up little packages. And I said, what are you doing, Ma? Oh, we're sending these to Cuba. They need things. I never forgot that my whole entire life, because it was just, this was like early 60s or late 50s. I was a little kid. And that's how I was, you know, came to know something about this country, Cuba. But for us to have an embargo, for us to force a world embargo on a little small country, which of course Cuba wouldn't like to call itself that, but you know, she's not big compared to this, physically. What in God's name did they want from them? What? What have we got to prove? And the sad thing is we have nothing to prove except that we're bullies. That's what we're proving. And any country that wants to go in the direction that the United States is going, we're not going anywhere. We're going down fast because Trump got us there, and now Biden is no bowl of cherries either. They're just happy they got rid of him. But now they're not so, you know, there's always going to be something that goes wrong. But,
Roberto,
you know, it's
would
just,
you like to respond? Tell us your name.
I just want to use the films that I saw to respond. How long can this go on? How long do we have to put up with this? How long, how long, how long, how long?
well, I think that's a question to the United Nations. I mean, they should be really helping. If anyone should be helping Cuba, it should be the UN.
The UN has an answer for that every single year. And almost all of the countries in the world vote against embargo. So they do have an answer for that question, and they're against embargo.
Well, then they should embargo the United States.
The embargo has an answer too, because the Helms-Burton law establishes that they are going to keep the sanctions until there's no free elections in Cuba, there is no change in Cuba. So that's part of the same intricacies of the problem. The same laws that are the basis of the embargo are the ones who are preventing the change. And it's, I have to say, it is immoral. It is, regardless of the situation in Cuba, it's immoral and it's not fair.
And it is problematic that Biden right now, every time that he wants to address the relation with Cuba, he talks about the Cuban people, but he listens to Cuban Americans. He doesn't listen to the Cuban people. So there is a contradiction there because the interests are very different. All the polls that I've seen, you can correct me if I'm wrong, most of the serious polls that I've seen said that the large majority of the Cuban people are against the embargo. So you cannot say that on behalf of the Cuban people, you're doing something that they don't want. So, and that is what is happening. He has the ear of Florida because obviously there is no Cuba policy in the Biden administration. There is an electoral strategy for Florida. That's what it is. They are not interested in Cuba. They're interested in electoral strategies in Florida. And that is an issue that the foreign policy of this country has to solve.
I think Harold's point is well made, and I think it exposes the complexity of the issue and of a resolution to the issue, because in my analysis, you know, the United States has long had a dual problem when it comes to Cuba or generally in its foreign policy, and it's an ignorance combined with an arrogance, right? And which is not to deny a lot of the stuff we saw in the second film of the internal issues and complaints and demands that the people of Cuba are making on their own government. But the United States' imperial posture toward Cuba, right, is born out of an ignorance and thinks it knows everything, has an arrogance. But on top of that, and this is the complicated part, I think, is that, as they were alluding to there, is that the problem with changing our policy isn't that we haven't realized that the embargo doesn't work. And it isn't that we haven't even had majority of people, both in polls and in Congress, right, think that. You know, part of it is that Obama couldn't get rid of it, even though he would have, but it's out of his hands, it's in the Congress's hands. And the other thing is what Harold said, is that this is a litmus test for Cubans in South Florida. There's not a whole lot of Cubans in the United States relative to the whole country, but because they're concentrated in Florida, because Florida is a swing state and Cubans are a swing vote in a swing state, and because when Biden beat Trump, and he did beat Trump, right? He lost Florida. And that is even more important, and that explains, I think as Harold very well said, the strategy that he had of going very, very slow up until July, and then July 11th, it was a no-brainer politically. It's all about supporting the Cuban people and their protest and doing nothing to change the policy, even a policy on remittances during a COVID crisis, right, which is low-hanging fruit and you could think you could justify on humanitarian grounds, has been delayed, studied, because it seems to be more important to keep the money out of the Cuban government's hands than to get it into the Cuban people's hands.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yes, ma'am. Sorry.
Hi. Sorry. I'm actually a journalist and a documentary producer myself. I write for a humanitarian publication, amongst others. I found that the explanation that you had about the film very, very interesting. The one thing that actually I was just a little bit, actually not surprised of, but which I noticed was that the film was produced in Cuba. I mean, it was, there was the state's cinema production that was stated in the credits and all. And I understand that, the question that I would have been asking, had I been producing the film, but if obviously I'm not in Cuba and all, would have been, who is really responsible, aside from, blaming the embargo, And that, you know, there were suggestions that there is state mismanagement in the economy, but yet, you know, what we know of the management of the economy is that it's run in large part by the army, and, you know, taking all the, you know, charging the taxes on the remittances, and you know, anything that's imported and so forth. So, you know, I understand that, but my question actually is more, you know, as all of you, you know, had been, you know, growing up in Cuba, is it not convenient, you know, for the government itself to maintain the status quo? I mean, you know, beyond the facts, beyond the politics here in the U.S. that's so important for what happens in Cuba. You know, how do you see the government's position? Is it not convenient for the embargo to continue, and for, you know, because of how the you know, those people in power are able to benefit from the status quo?
Can I start? I'll be brief. That reminds
But don't be so intelligent as usual, and you say everything that's good, and no one else has anything to say.
No, because I forgot to say something about the aesthetics of the movie, and it's the chaotic drive or energy that has because of all these cinematographic elements, the animation, the black and white, all the juxtapositions of elements. It gives that impression that Cuba is a chaos, and that is exactly what you're saying is part of that. There is a component which is exactly that. Cuban government used an embargo to justify their position for many years, and keeping the status quo of a nomenclatura of group of people that are holding on to power, and they are afraid because if there is a change, their heads are going. I mean, they're not going to be there anymore. So there is one part of that, and usually it's the elderly or the oldest generation, and those who are in power, who are controlling the economy, which are the military in a big part. So that is definitely part of the equation. There may be people, like for example, my neighbor from Camagüey, who is a professor at a university. She is like 70 years old. She doesn't have any family outside Cuba. I'm the only one who sends remittances, used to, because now I can't. And she still believes in the revolution. She still believes in the revolution, and she says that she's gonna, you know, that is the embargo is to blame, and she has complete trust in the Escanel and the way that they're managing the economy. So that's another element. So it's not one answer. It's like.
I think that as long as we have an embargo, it will be very hard to determine where the embargo ends and government responsibility begins. Like, it's very hard to make a difference there between the two of those. A couple of days ago, there was a fist fight in the headquarters of the Communist Party in Havana. That's unprecedented. And the fist fight was because of difference in ideas. Because obviously there are factions. So we have to be very careful when we talk about the Cuban government. There is no one Cuban government or one Communist Party. There are factions that have been maintained invisible intentionally. They have tried to maintain those differences intentionally for a long time. And what is happening is that the embargo, and I see that in the difference from the normalization period with Obama to the Trump years. With Obama, you had the reformers of the Communist Party were advancing. The people that say we want change, we're going to change things, let's open up the economy. They were making huge gains. And what happened with Trump is that then the hardliners, the Cold War ideologues, came back to power, more in power than ever. And every time that Trump said something hard against Cuba, they were in power. So the harder the U.S. government is on Cuba, the more it empowers the most conservative factions of the Communist Party. So that's what is happening.
We gotta end very soon. So why don't the two of you finish up with some brief comments. Roberto.
I'll be brief. I gotta say that they already said everything I was gonna say. You know, I mean, right on target. And he did a great job there too.
Thank you.
Let him finish. Okay.
Well, very quickly, one thing for you to, if you now that you watch the films, remember that the documentary was filmed in 2015, 2016. Those were hopeful days for the Cuban people. And the promise there was that we are reforming the economy, and now more or less we are trying to normalize ties with the United States. So many topics were up for discussion. That's not the situation today. So that country has changed in many important ways. Now, regarding the embargo and all the problems, my position is this. Yes, when you think of it morally and from a principles point of view, it should end tomorrow. But guys, that's not the world we are living in. That's not the world we're living in. We like it or not, it's a different discussion. That's not the world we're living in. Now, the Cuban government can change things within Cuba without asking the US for permission. That's the only thing that we control. I wouldn't say 100%, but we've got a lot more control over the economic policies and the economic system, and even the political system within Cuba, than we do on when and if the US Congress will ever change the embargo or lift it. Guys, let's live in the world that exists, not in Mars. And the world that exists is that there is a hegemon out there that is called the United States of America. Foreign policy, we don't like it for the most part. Fine, that's a world that exists. And frankly speaking, sometimes the alternatives have been even worse. The Soviet Union was no less. Let us not forget that. Not even talking about fascism and Nazism in Europe and Asia. So we humans, we are terrible. I mean, we're a disaster. Our history is killing each other, fighting over land, power, and something else. But we can change things within Cuba. Let's do that. Let's start with that. And, you know, it's always easy and kind of convenient to say, you know, we wait for the savior that will come from overseas to solve our problems. That's a problem, that mentality in the underdeveloped countries we have. No, come on, stop talking about colonization. Happened many years ago. Let's start talking about what we can do ourselves within Cuba. The problem is that when we recognize that we are unable to sit and talk with each other, that's when the problem starts. Well, so that's my proposal. You know, let's start with what we can do instead of what may happen tomorrow or in 10 days or, you know, in 20 years.
As they say in Cuban, cerraste con broche de oro. Y aquí tenemos un ejemplo de colaboración cívica entre amigos y no tan amigos, pero podemos estar aquí compartiendo. Closed very well with a golden touch by Ricardo, and we are a good example of meeting and sharing and disagreeing civilly. So thank you for coming, and let's have a group hug. I think we need that right now, right? Thanks a lot for coming.